Well, we were happily returning from a Malta convoy without anything particular. My friend, who later I became his best man, was captain's office writer, PO writer. His office was next door to me. And I suppose between about 4 o'clock-ish thereafter, I went into his office. He was at the typewriter typing, and I said, "Coming up for some tea, Alan?" "Yes, I just finished what I'm doing." And he was doing that when there was this great crash and all the lights went out. Almost under the bridge, I think, pretty well amidships. We only lost one man who happened to be in that section. It was his birthday, I understand. This is anecdotal. And he'd had several tots and was asleep under one of the lockers. But other people in that flat reckoned that they were up to their knees in oil fuel before they could get out.
I'd just come back from an AS patrol, and we'd landed on, and I went down to the mess, and I was having a cup of tea, and I nodded off to sleep, sitting at the table, and cups were sliding up. There'd been a bang when the torpedoes hit, but I mean, that life was full of bangs, and I didn't take much notice of it. I just thought it was a depth charge that had gone off rather close, or something like that. I didn't disturb me an awful lot until these cups started sliding off the table and tinkling against the lockers, and I realised that there was a big list on. So then went up top and joined hundreds of others who were on the flight deck, and abandoned ship had been given, and I just slid down a rope onto the Legion, which was a destroyer which came alongside.
Well, we just got airborne, and I don't know, we actually saw the torpedo strike, but suddenly the carrier started listing over to the port side, I think it was, and we realized then what had happened. She'd been torpedoed. Oh, sorry. She'd been torpedoed, and as I say, we were near enough to Gibraltar to carry on and land at Gibraltar. And first thing, daylight next morning, we went out to find the carrier, and she'd gone. But a destroyer went alongside and took off as many of the crew as they could, and only the one person was lost. But I remember a great friend of mine, a fellow air gunner. He was much older than me. He'd been a survivor from the Courageous when she was torpedoed in the western approaches earlier on in the war. And having been torpedoed once, he didn't wait to see what was going to happen. He was over the side, and he was swimming for North Africa.
I just landed on. Well, Esmond had an engine failure, brought the squadron back out. Well, he kept landing on early. I brought the squadron back. And I landed on first, went up the bridge, and eventually on the bridge reporting when the last aircraft came on. So they had called Bird. Did an absolute perfect landing. At that moment the torpedo hit. And naturally we'd given him a hell of a reprimand that day because he'd broken several aircraft, had bad landings. And he leapt out of the aircraft, I'm told. My God, what have I done this time? Because literally, as he touched down, the bloody torpedo hit. Whole ship shook and clouds of smoke everywhere, and he was quite convinced he'd done something wrong, poor chap. He went on to get a DSO on the Channel attack. But I was on the bridge at the time, and we'd started turning out of wind when the ship heeled quite a bit with that, and she started heeling enormously. And I was still on the bridge when she went past her critical angle, which was about 22 degrees. And the captain, not having the slightest interest in what had happened, had it been an enormous explosion in the ship, we had no idea it was a torpedo at the time, quite rightly, I thought at the time, gave the order to abandon ship. But there was, in fact, she didn't think cut out later. Then we started to do so because she completely lost power. And I collected a few people together and lowered a cutter and went off in it with my observer. And these are artificers, and then realised the ship didn't seem to be sinking, so we came back. She went back on board again.
After how long?
Like 20 minutes or so, half an hour, I don't know. But she didn't seem to be heating even on. There weren't many people there.
I was having a cup of tea on the bridge with the signal officer, and we'd already given notice of what time we were going to get into harbour. We were undoubtedly relaxed, and the first thing I remember was a bang and a lot of smoke coming up one of the aircraft lifts on the flight deck, which was abreast the bridge. The captain was in his cabin having a cup of tea, and immediately all the communications within the ship failed, which was one of the difficulties. And she began taking a list, and it wasn't long before we discovered there'd been a hit underneath us with one of these magnetic warheads, I suppose, and the boiler rooms were flooding. And we lost all electric power, and because the furnaces went out, and I wouldn't wish to go into details about all that because it's all been recorded so carefully. But she went on listing, and we had no real order in which to give the ship's company about a situation like this, about abandoning ship. And we had, of course, an enormous number of aircraft people on board who weren't wanted. They were in the way when the ship was there. We wanted to save them and get them out of the ship. And so we ordered everybody to muster on the flight deck. And owing to the lack of communications on the ship, this had to be passed by what are called call boys, which were boys who went round with a bosun's call, saying, "Do you hear there?" And like a game of rumours, you pass messages from mouth to mouth, and it ends up absolutely different to when it started. And the rumour got round that they were ordered to abandon ship. And this was discovered and immediately cancelled, but too late to stop the engineers from, as far as I can recollect, from again dousing the boilers, which they'd managed to get going, because the abandoned ship required that they should put them out. And this was awful, because if we'd kept those boilers alight, we would have had electric power, and we could have probably got the ship into jib.
And we immediately went into a bit of an angle, a list, and he hadn't got a torch. I'd got one, but I got another one in my office, so we nipped into my office and picked up my second torch and checked up all the deadlights were firm, and he nipped up to the bridge to see the captain, being a captain's writer, and I went up to the commander flying, And then the order was given, and all these orders had to be transferred by word of mouth because the sound had gone, all the loud hailer had gone. All hands on the port. It was that we were listening to the starboard. All hands on the port side await further orders, and then a little later than that, within an hour, I suppose, we had the orders to abandon ship.
Against the Spanish Armada and against Germany in 2 world wars, an Ark Royal helped us to win victory. The third Ark Royal is the most famous. Fighting in 32 operations, she was repeatedly sunk by the late Lord Haw before being in fact torpedoed in 1941.
Yes, well, a lot of people jumped off. A lot of panic. People did release the Carly rafts, and there was a stream of boats of these life-saving things. Because we're still doing about 8 knots, 12 knots, whatever it was, and slowing down slowly as we leant over about 14, 15 degrees, which is much more alarming than it sounds, because it's unusual. Anyway. We all stood on the the high side, thinking that our weight would have some influence. But, we'll always keep the boat upright. But it didn't make much difference, so we sailed on there, and we, more or less, everything gone out, the lights had gone out, all power stopped, no communications, nothing. Nothing worked. So we wandered about there, wondering, well, what was next? A lot of chaps were jumping over the sides, doing silly things like that. So eventually, my next memory was Captain Morn deciding to go aft. I see him now walking swiftly from the bridge along the flight deck, shouting. But you could see him saying, "Abandon ship," with his lips, but he couldn't hear anything because he completely lost his voice. Poor chap. It was his ship. Abandon ship, he was trying to say. So I suppose that, well, we said, we'd better abandon ship. Of course, at that time, all the other destroyers that weren't taking off survivors were going out, doing a ring around poor old Ark, which was like that, dropping depth charges. Oh, God, they went on dropping depth charges for about 3 hours. I mean, this submarine fired an electric torpedo about 5 miles away or something. So I don't know what the hell, they killed a lot of fish. That's about all they did.
When we were all on the port side waiting for further orders, there were, I suppose, perhaps a dozen panicked and jumped over the side in Carly floats. And they were paddling away, going round in circles. In fact, I think it was probably a good thing because it was comic relief. Everybody was chi-hiking them and all the rest of it, you see. And in fact, some of them, there was a couple of senior ratings there that got into serious trouble with the commander afterwards.
Yeah, I think the things that you think about is I'm halfway up to the flight deck, and I remembered all of the things I'd bought in Gib to take home, and I thought, God, I'll go back down and get them. And I started to go back down, and the ship went a bit more, and I thought, no, it's a bit dicey, you better get up top. And I sort of nipped up top and just stood there in the queue waiting to get somewhere. And the Legion upper deck was absolutely packed with survivors. And she steamed around for hours, seemingly, trying to find the submarine that had done the damage. In the meantime, they tried to get the Ark Royal in tow, but eventually that wasn't very successful and she sunk.
I went down through the hangars and I found a lot of people had ripped open the flotation gear, the rafts that you have in aeroplanes. You've got a handle of release that normally if an aircraft falls in the sea, the salt water will cause the dinghy to to blow out from where it's contained, or you have a hand release. Well, someone thought, well, we'd have some more life-saving equipment, so they went and pulled these releases, and all of our lovely aeroplanes, all tethered onto the deck in the hangars, had all their life equipment sticking out of their sides. Of course, what they hadn't realized is by blowing them up, they couldn't get them through the access doors, so they stayed inside. That was that impression. I thought I was wearing my oldest uniform. My cabin, alas, was on the starboard side and was underwater. There was no way I could get down to. Everything was underwater. And my guns, oh dear, it didn't occur to me then. So I went down to the quarterdeck.
While we were in the boat, a lot of people had got out of the ship into a destroyer, which was astern of her. And as I had these 4 or 5 skilled artificers on board, we thought it makes sense to go back and see if we could do anything to help. And having got back, they then decided to bring a destroyer alongside to see if they could get some electric power, because the problem of that ship, which is a shattering one really, you couldn't get electric power without steam, and you couldn't raise steam without electric power, and there was no diesel generator. So without electric power, the senior engineer, Oliver, who was still on board with a few chaps down in the engine room, could do nothing. And Legion, I think, the destroyer, came alongside. Now this time, it was just my observer and I, and we chucked the heaving line down and pulled some enormous great wires with hooks on the end. Hadn't the slightest idea what to do with them. And finally, we found some enormous great studs somewhere, and one of the officers in the Legion shouted, "We'll have a go at those," and we put them on, and sure enough, on came some lights, and Oliver got some power and was able to raise steam. And we were at one moment actually under our own power doing about 3 or 4 knots back towards Gibraltar.
Let us pay tribute to a gallant ship, His Majesty's aircraft carrier Ark Royal, many times sunk by rumour. Now she has gone down in action. Ark Royal was first attacked by German bombers in September 1939. They claimed she was sunk, but since then she's been hitting Britain's enemies and hitting them hard. Torpedoes got her in the end, but look at the balance sheet and see who comes off best. Ark Royal destroyed or damaged over 100 warplanes. Off Sardinia, her aircraft destroyed a battleship and 4 destroyers. She was in the bombardment of Genoa. She played a big part in the slaughter of the Bismarck. Wherever there's been trouble, there's been Ark Royal causing it.
Well, because the Ark Royal was more or less based on all these big ships and Ark Royal, and they based partly on Gibraltar. Well, she'd been out at sea several days, and we got the message that she'd been hit, torpedoed. And so, of course, our first problem was, well, if she remains afloat and gets here, we'll have to dry dock her as soon as we can. Well, the big dry dock was empty, big graving dock, you know, except for we used to berth small ships in it. We cleared that and emptied it, and they prepared, the shipwright people prepared the chocks for docking Ark Royal. And we were waiting. Of course, I was in the dockyard all the time, as we didn't know exactly how long she'd take to get to Gibraltar, or what would happen on the way, or anything like that. So I was in with the different parties of men, waiting to receive her, and to put her into dry dock, if it was possible, as soon as we could. My friend, Tom Ascott, being the senior draftsman, he was interested in the construction of the Ark Royal and all that lot, and he had his plans there with all the tanks. And as we sat in my office having a coffee, he said to me, he said, "You know, Tug," he says, "the Ark Royal shouldn't sink." I said, I don't know about that. And he explained all these tanks. If they flood this tank, they counteract that one being flooded. And by his system, yes, she would keep afloat enough for them to. And we already had other ships standing by and tugs there helping her, you see. And plenty of craft around to keep molesters away. So he said, if they do as they've been told, we shall dock her all right. Anyhow, we waited and waited until at last we got the message, she's gone. And of course, poor old Tom, he was heartbroken. He said if they'd have done what they've been taught to do, she no need to go. Well, ever after that, damage defence and damage control was made a special item on board ships, and they insisted, and it was supervised, that they done what they were told and knew what they had to do in the case of receiving a torpedo here, that tank being flooded, this one, that they could keep any ship afloat. Yes, but it was a big ship to lose.
Now, the interesting thing was that the Legion had come up alongside, and she had covered the whole of her forecastle with lashed hammocks. And so we were able to jump down from our lower hangar deck onto the Legion. I suppose the height, a little bit higher than the ceiling.
About 10 feet.
Something like that. And, of course, nobody needed even to get their feet wet. But about 1,400 of us got aboard this destroyer. We were wandering around dropping depth charges that said the Legion and the Laffery. I'm not sure whether the Laffery may have been the one that took the navigate, people that stayed aboard to try and save her. You see, people, damage control people, they stayed aboard. They probably came off on the Laffery later.
Well, destroyers were coming along to take off survivors, which is quite handy. I mean, you just jump from one side to the other. And blow me down out of the hatch in the deck, because that's the high side, you see, it was all right, came the paymaster commander with 2 huge suitcases. So I said to him with great surprise, Pay, I see you're taking every precaution, I said. Which I felt was an ambiguous remark. What I really meant was he's going for the rat is deserting the sinking ship and making sure he's got all his bits and pieces with him, which is exactly what he had. And I didn't know this actually at the time, so I helped him with his suitcases to get across to Legion, or was it Lively, that were taking us all on the thing. And I say one of the bags might have fallen in the water because the gap was not that big, about 3 foot or 4 foot. So nothing more was heard about this. He got, and in due course I just stepped across from the Ark Royal's upper side onto the forecastle of this destroyer, where we blissfully were sent down to the wardroom, got pied and forgot all about the thing.
Of her 1,500-odd complement, the great majority were saved to find another ship and go on with the work they began so well. No use denying that her loss is a blow to us, but she made them pay tenfold to get her. So in the Mediterranean that knew your glory in war, you rest in peace. Sleep well, Ark Royal. We give you our grateful thanks.
Now, this time, because she was in danger of bumping alongside, because of a bit of a swell running, Legion had cast off. And then, we were sitting there very happy. I remember 2 or 3 other people had joined us. And my observer had managed to kick open the boardroom bar and got some cans of beer. And you're quietly sitting there drinking those and throwing the empty cans at the rats. And when there was a terrific lurch and the power went again, this was because the funnel uptake went down and across to the boiler room, under the hangar deck, and up. That elbow was underwater, and it collapsed and cut the power off. The pity was, because we'd done no rehearsal of damage control at all in that ship. Not that we as aircrew might have been involved in it, because had we counter-flooded and got her upright, that might not have happened. I don't really know. There's a lot of work done on it afterwards. I used to go down to the damage control school and talk occasionally.
Destroyer Laforet came alongside. We had made some efforts before that from the Laforet to put electric leads on board and try and get some power to our own pumps. But this simply didn't work out. We couldn't get enough power from the destroyer. And that had to be abandoned. And there was very little. We could not get the boilers going again, because by that time the ship had got a strong list and the boiler room ventilation was underwater. And so the destroyers came alongside and took off as many as were deemed not necessary for the ship to get her into jib. We still thought we could. We got a tug from jib and started being towed. The list was getting quite severe, but we were so close that I understand even Lord Gort, who was the governor of Gibraltar, went up to the southern end of Europa Point to have a look at us through his field glasses. They could see the whole thing going on. And we didn't make much headway with this tug. And the night wore on, a beautiful calm night, and the list got more and more severe. And eventually it was perfectly obvious she was not going to get in. And so the captain ordered us to abandon the ship.
But one night we were actually reckoned we were going to get her back in time for colours. You were coming into jib, time for colours in the morning. Anyhow, we went on quite a long time. Then they got a tug out from jib, and she was being towed back. And finally, she was listing further and further, and Morn decided, the captain decided that he must get everybody out. And the only people we forgot was a gunnery house for 4 chaps up on the forecastle. And I think it's one of the most terrifying moments of my life, because we got destroyer alongside, and people were sliding across, the last few of us were sliding across the rope to that. And Morn said, well, I've got anybody left on, but I was going to have a look. And walking round that ship at the angle she was at, and the only noise was the rats squeaking and the ticking of the clocks. And then suddenly I went down the crunch and a lurch. And fortunately I did, because there was some bloke down below, and he duly heard the buzz and came up. But for years afterwards, I couldn't sleep in a room with a ticking clock. And I had no idea why. It was just extraordinary. I woke up in such a nightmare. And suddenly dawned on me why. And then I was all right, didn't worry me the slightest. Anyhow, we eventually slid off into a destroyer, and captain came down last, followed me down. And suddenly realised we'd forgotten the unfortunate gunnery house and his 4 chaps up forward. We had to nip up and get them. So that was it, and finally she went, very sad. And the only good thing was that my observer and I, who'd done a lot of sailing in one of the 14-foot dinghies, managed to get that over the side one stage of the sea, persuaded the destroyer to take it back. And we raced that dinghy the next afternoon in jib and gave it to the club, and it was there years later when I went out there, still preserved.
But I did say much earlier on that she was in a very bad state, like a worn-out motor car. She'd never had a refit. And no doubt a lot of the technical difficulties which they experienced down below wouldn't have happened if we'd had our machinery in better order. And so she just gradually got more and more of a list, and shortly after we left, We were taken off by an MTB, I think, and she heeled over and sank. Which was very sad because errors were undoubtedly made. We might have got her in. No, I and the rest of us spent our time trying to get the Admiralty to give us new uniforms. It's strange that when your ship sinks, you are absolutely left with nothing.
Nearly 1,600 officers and ratings were in the Ark Royal when she was torpedoed. All save one man were saved. Ark Royal had taken part in 32 naval actions, and now they're getting leave, and they've earned it.
There's still arguments as to whether the right thing was done. I understand a fire broke out and they've had to flood part of it, which made the list even further. But they did try to take her in tow, and they came quite a little way. But we went back to Gibraltar, and the next morning we all turned out on the jetty waiting to see the Ark come in, and we were amazed when she didn't. There's still arguments. I happened to see our navigating officer, Admiral Sir Hector Maclean, and I was with him last year, and he was saying to me, the Ark should never have been lost. And I mean, he was an experienced man. He later became captain of the Eagle, the later Eagle, and he said the Ark should never have been lost. There was errors made in trying to save her. So I don't know. It's a great pity that she was, because she was a lovely ship. That she had been so run down that watertight doors were no longer watertight. This was one of the reasons she needed her refit. That she had, as I say, she covered 205,000 miles without any sort of refit, and lots of the things that should have worked wouldn't work.
Otherwise, we only lost one man in the Ark Royal. He'd been asleep in the lower steering position, just under where the torpedo hit, and he was overwhelmed before he could wake up. There was, again, one of these awful courts of inquiry. And I think Lord Cork came out again to investigate whether there should be a court-martial of the captain. Hearsay was that Winston Churchill has said, I want a culprit for this. And I had to stay with some others to give evidence at this court of inquiry, which indeed led to a court-martial.
When Ark Royal sank, there were only 2 casualties. Here are some of the ship's company back in Britain and looking forward to a well-deserved month's leave. Three of them came to the mic.
Here we are, back in London, after many adventures from the Ark Royal. We're very glad to be here. There's 2 ratings, one chief stoker, another chief petty officer, who will tell you some of their experiences that they had before the old Ark eventually sunk.
And as we left the ship, I was one of the last 4 to leave. And I will say this, the last one to come down was the captain. And as he come down the rope from on the ship's side, the searchlights played on him, and the crew of the destroyer that was taking us off gave him 3 cheers.
And the chief petty officer.
The pay commander was saved, and the ship's money, a large sum. Thank you for the money. And we also saved the 2 cats, one Oscar and the other Harry.
Of course, the story is of the paymaster commander who brought the money off in a suitcase and dropped it in the water. That was fished out, and we had to count that money. We had all this wet. What's the point of saving money like that? It was no use anyway. But we had to count this £10,000 of pound notes when we got back to Gibraltar.
So nothing more after that. Of course, we got back into Gib, and we were all berthed in Argus, which happened to be there at the time, and until about 6 months later. You won't believe it, but 6 months later, I got an OHMS from the Admiralty, and it was a bill, a wardroom bill, to Messing until lunchtime on the 13th of November. They hardly dare charge me for tea. And you know, we had day books, which, you know about day books? Anyway, every drink you order, you sign with a chip. And it had all been done. That chap, that paymaster commander, had got the wardroom wine books, he got the officers' pay sheets, he got everything. And I'd had, because it was really a farewell deal, wasn't flying at all, I had about 5 or 6 gins and a bottle of wine at lunchtime. Of course, you know, that's why I joined the Navy, in order to have a decent life while fighting a war. And it was all itemized, and here was a ship being sunk, all my uniform, all my vesting and guns had all gone. I'd been done for right up to within 3 hours of the time the ship was torpedoed. I thought, that really is getting clever, isn't it? I got awarded £49 compensation for being sunk, because they said all officers at sea, going to sea in certain waters at sea, was only allowed to have £50 worth of gear on board. You're not allowed to have anything, and all this stuff was. And this was quoting an AFO. And I pointed out that the AFO was printed about 3 days before the Ark was sunk. How did you think that, in all honesty, A, to deliver that AFO on board, and B, to have it absorbed so that we, the officers, who got about 5 or 10 times as much gear as put down there, could, and where would we put it? What, in Gib? With whom? Somewhere in a warehouse. So they gave me another £100 after that. But all the same, £140 in 1941 was not off feed. It really was too bad.